Good evening and thanks for joining us. There is no let-up in the violence in the Middle East. Israel's Prime Minister says he does not intend to stop attacking Gaza despite mounting global pressure and outrage at the civilian casualties. And Hamas keeps firing back. Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 200 people in Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry says 59 children and 35 women are among the dead. Israel says it struck 110 targets last night. It says it only targets Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which have fired thousands of rockets at Israel. But as hospitals in Gaza are overwhelmed with the wounded, doctors too are being killed. Dr. Ayman Abu Alouf was head of internal medicine at Gaza's biggest hospital. He was killed when an Israeli missile hit his neighborhood early Sunday. He trained new doctors at that hospital. Dr. Moeen Ahmad Al-Alul was killed too. He was one of the few neurologists in Gaza. Israeli civilians have endured the constant threat of rockets fired indiscriminately from Gaza. Israel's Iron Dome defense system intercepts most of them, but dozens of Israelis have been injured and at least 10 have died. An international push for a unified call for an immediate end to the hostilities has been thwarted by Israel's top ally, the United States. We'll have more on that in a moment, but we begin with the airstrikes. Israel says it has many more targets to hit in Gaza and is ignoring increasingly loud calls. It is using disproportionate force. Eric Sorensen has our top story tonight.
A rare, uplifting moment. A 6-year-old girl rescued in the rubble in Gaza City. But there is little joy. Her mother and 4 siblings were killed. Her father lies by her side in hospital. After a night of what's being called the heaviest bombardment yet from Israeli airstrikes, there is, by daylight, evidence of widespread destruction and death. 3 apartment buildings were destroyed this weekend. They kept bombing, says this Gaza resident. They should hit those who hit them, not the poor people in their homes. Israel says its air campaign is designed to target Hamas. One commander was killed in this car, and says several kilometers of Hamas tunnels were destroyed.
We've struck hundreds of other underground targets inside Gaza, and that's the one incident where we saw houses collapsing as a result. So we're looking into it, and I want to be clear, it is not our aim. We have no business killing civilians.
Hamas rockets also continue to be launched, and while most are intercepted, many are getting through. Some Israeli residents voice support for the military. We have to continue until there is a long-term ceasefire, says this man. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared again the Israeli campaign will continue. And Hamas is not asking for a ceasefire either.
When we think about Netanyahu and Hamas, they both benefit from this. They represent more extreme and violent factions of each society. They're not doing good. They're taking advantage of people's worst emotions for their own political gain.
Israel's aim to impose a heavy cost on Hamas, says this expert.
It wants to reestablish deterrence. It wants Hamas to think twice about firing rockets across.
The goal for Hamas?
Wants to show it can stay in the game, that it can surprise the Israelis, that it's remarkably resilient, and that's why it will continue to fire rockets.
The Arab world is large and frustrated. In many cities, anger is boiling. Negotiations have done nothing, says this man. He hopes the fighting will lead to the so-called liberation of Palestine. But military superiority is with the Israelis. Ground bombardment so far is coming from the border, a reminder that the conflict could turn even more deadly if Israeli ground forces start moving into Gaza. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
Canada has joined other countries calling for restraint on all sides and an immediate end to the violence. In a statement, Global Affairs says the toll, particularly on civilians, including women and children, has already been too great. It says Canada supports Israel's right to live in peace with its neighbours within secure boundaries and fully supports Israel's right to assure its own security. This right also comes with immense responsibility and obligation to act in accordance with international law. The U.S. is Israel's greatest ally and provides more than $3 billion in aid every year. Its position has always been Israel has the right to defend itself. But how far does that go? A growing number of Americans, including members of President Joe Biden's own party, want him to do more to pressure Israel to end the violence. Late today, Biden spoke to Israel's prime minister and afterward put out a statement supporting a ceasefire, but not calling for an immediate end to the violence. Jackson Proskow reports.
His progressive administration has adopted a decidedly familiar stance on Middle East conflict.
Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live in safety and security and enjoy equal measure of freedom, prosperity, and democracy.
As Hamas rockets are fired into Israel, and as Israeli bombs rain down on Gaza, the Biden administration has remained staunchly in the corner of America's longtime ally.
There is no equivalence between a terrorist group indiscriminately firing rockets at civilians and a country defending its people from those attacks.
But at home, Biden faces growing pushback from those who believe the U.S. needs to do more to protect Palestinian civilians, including a growing number of fellow Democrats and progressives. In a New York Times op-ed, Senator Bernie Sanders wrote, "We can no longer be apologists for the right-wing Netanyahu government," adding, "Israel has the absolute right to live in peace and security, but so do the Palestinians."
Our approach is through quiet, intensive diplomacy, and that's where we feel we can be most effective.
Biden has spoken privately with both Palestinian and Israeli leadership. Speaking with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu late Monday, Biden said he supports both Israeli self-defense and, for the first time, a ceasefire.
The United States is just trying to minimize its role. And I would be very surprised if there's anybody at the top of the Biden team or administration who's saying, here's a chance to push the parties towards peace.
Generations of American presidents have tried and failed to broker a lasting peace. The Biden administration says it believes a two-state solution is the best way. It's unclear if it's willing to help foster one, let alone wade into the current situation. Yet the U.S. retains considerable influence here. The Biden administration authorized $735 million in arms sales to Israel just days before this latest violence erupted. That's on top of billions of dollars in continued U.S. military support. Donna?
Jackson Proskow in Washington, thanks.